Right, I thought I'd take this opportunity to go over some of the sources that we might come across in our exam on Monday. What I thought I'd do is particularly focus on the sources from the middle section, which is the first questions you'll get on the Germany topic. The way they tend to do sources in the exam for the Germany section is that you'll find that they're all related to the same period of time. So looking at the screen at the moment, we've got one here from the 1920s, but in another paper, it's the rise of Hitler. And the next one here we've got life in Nazi Germany, and this one here we've got about persecution. So I thought I'd go through some of these and perhaps talk about the sources and see if we can answer those questions and see how we get on. So the first one is, this one's quite an old paper. It's from January 2010, back in the days when there used to be a January exam as well. We start with source B, and it says, this is from Dr. Kapp, an extreme nationalist expressing his views about Germany's problems in 1919. Hopefully that name rings a bell. That's the same Kapp as Wolfgang Kapp, who eventually leads the Kapp Putsch in 1920. So the question here is, what is the question here? How far does this source explain the problems faced by Weimar Republic in 1919 to 1920? So how far does this source tell us about the problems that the Weimar government is facing in 1919 to 1920? So what does Dr. Kapp say? Prices are rising, hardship is growing, starvation threatens, the government lacks authority and is not capable of overcoming the danger. From the east, we are threatened with destruction by communism. So it does tell us quite a bit about the problems that Germany is facing. Prices are rising. Yeah, there's economic hardship in Germany at the time. That's not surprising because they just fought a war and they're still recovering from that. This is before reparations had kicked in. If you remember, reparations come in a little bit later. They're not in the original Treaty of Versailles. They decide the amount later on, so we can't refer to that. But what we can talk about is the fact that Wolfgang Kapp has highlighted the fact that there is economic hardship, starvation threatens, there's a shortage of food. The Germans actually had to resort to start including using sawdust in their bread to mix in with the flour to try and make, to save flour and keep bread producing more bread. So they are suffering quite a bit. So in this sense, that the source does give us a good idea about the threats that Germany are under. It says here, from the east, we're threatened with destruction by communism. Well, it's suggesting that perhaps the Russians next door might launch an attack in the future. And it wasn't just Germany, all countries in Europe were worried about the communist Russians. So that makes sense. What it doesn't tell us, though, is some other things. So it doesn't tell us about the uprisings. It doesn't mention the fact that the Spartans had an uprising in 1919, in January 1919. And actually, that's a really important point because the question is asking us about the problems that the Weimar Republic faced. Well, actually, that was a huge problem. Although he does mention the government lacks authority. Well, yeah, because in the Spartans uprising, they didn't crush it themselves. They had to ask the Freikorps to crush it for them, who are the right-wing group, if you remember. So it doesn't go into enough detail about that. And of course, the question is asking us between 1919 and 1920. Well, Kapp Putsch isn't. So Kapp isn't here saying about his plans for his Kapp Putsch. That hasn't been mentioned either. So yeah, it is useful, but it doesn't mention the uprisings. So we can talk about both its usefulness and its lack of usefulness to get the full marks. So that's question B. Right, question C. Let's zoom out a little bit here. Right, so a cartoon published in Germany in 1923, and the question is, why was this cartoon published in 1923? Right, let's have a look. Why do we think this cartoon has been published in 1923? The mother is shouting, bread, bread. So why has the cartoonist drawn it like this? Hopefully, obviously we'll spot that there's a starving child in the picture, but they're surrounded by something falling from the sky because there's so much of it. 1923, hopefully that's all clicking in, and that's going to be money, currency. There's loads of it, there's too much of it. So when the question is, why was this cartoon published in 1923, what point do you think the cartoonist is making? Hopefully you're coming up with the idea that the point the cartoonist is making is actually that the Weimar government isn't helping out its people, and actually it's causing more problems for them because of hyperinflation. The Weimar government haven't helped out people because they printed too much money, which actually isn't solving any of the problems at all in Germany. Then you use your own contextual knowledge. So what do we know about this period? Well, in 1923, the French invaded the Ruhr because the Germans weren't paying their reparations, and to help pay for the workers going on strike with their passive resistance, the government starts churning out more money. Because that still causes problems, and it doesn't actually solve any of the economic hardships in Germany at the time. Okay, let's whiz on to the next one. This is an interesting one. If I zoom out again, this is again making reference to the Ruhr. A poster published in Germany in 1923. The woman represents France. The words at the bottom say, "Hands off the Ruhr." Now the question we're being asked here is, are you surprised by this source? Hopefully we can all agree that this isn't really a surprising source. The fact that the Germans have created a poster here in 1923 telling the French, "Hands off our Ruhr," isn't going to be a surprise. This is part of a government campaign to create posters, and we've seen ones before with the workers being told to use passive resistance. This is another example of the government going, right, how are we going to try and make sure that we rally the people in the Ruhr in particular and try and get them supporting our policy of not giving in to the French? We'll create posters to try and encourage them to support us. And so this poster has been produced because it's trying to get popular support for the idea that they're not going to give in to the French when they invade the Ruhr and take their raw materials. Okay, so again, the question is, are you surprised by the source? No, I'm not really surprised. You don't have to be both surprised and not surprised all the time, but this one, it's just not surprising. Describe the source. Well, at the bottom of the source it says "hands off the Ruhr," so you can use that as a quote, and then your own contextual knowledge, and hopefully you've got lots of contextual knowledge about that. We don't need to talk about hyperinflation. It's not asking us about what happens after this period. It's just asking us about the French invasion of the Ruhr. Okay, so that's our first paper. Let's have a look at the next one. Right, this one's about the rise of Hitler. So we start off with this source here. The question I should probably mention first is, where are we? Why was this poster published in Germany in 1932? Right, so remember, we always look at the italics first. A poster published in Germany in 1932. The text in the poster says, "The meaning of the Hitler salute. Millions stand behind me. A small man asking for a big donation." And that last bit is particularly important. Right, so this poster is published in Germany in 1932. 1932 is a really important year for Germany, particularly for politics, because it has, three elections really. The first two are, well, not the first two. The first one is a presidential election, which Hitler runs against Hindenburg and loses. But the other two, perhaps more important ones, are the election in July and the election in November. This poster, therefore, has been published to criticise the Nazis. The meaning of the Hitler salute. Millions stand behind me, a small man asking for a big donation. The fact it's showing Hitler as a small man and a bigger man behind it isn't going to hopefully is ringing alarm bells to us and saying, right, this isn't a Nazi poster. The Nazis wouldn't be keen to show Hitler as a small man because remember, he's the kind of godlike figure to them. So this is a political poster created by another political party. So why has another political party created this? Hopefully you'll remember about where Hitler's getting his money from. He's being backed by big businesses. Big businesses were funding Hitler because he made some promises to them, two in particular. First of all, he's going to crush communism. He said communism is a threat. Don't you worry, if you elect me or if you give me finance, if you give me money, I will be sure to crush communism. And the other thing he promises to do is control trade unions. And as we know, in 1933, he bans them. So this political party is making a point that workers don't support Hitler, don't support the Nazis, because they're being financed by big businesses. Big businesses don't care about the workers. I mean, they like the workers in the sense they do the work for them, but they want to keep wages low. Hitler is not going to try and increase wages whilst he's in power, because he's been taking money from big businesses. He's in their pocket. He's working for them, if you like. So this poster, once you get your head around the fact that it's a criticism of the Nazis, hopefully you start sticking to your mind, actually, yes, Hitler was financed by big businesses. Other political parties would use that to try and encourage working class people in Germany not to support him, because he's a friend of big businesses. He's going to help out the big businesses. He's not going to be helping out the workers. So, what else we got? Right, source C. So the question for source C is a very short source. How useful is this source as evidence of the cause of the Reichstag fire? Use the source and your own knowledge to explain your answer. Right, so it's a statement. Remember, we always look at the italics first. A statement issued by Hitler the day after the Reichstag fire in February 1933. This act of arson is the most outrageous act yet committed by communism in Germany. The burning of the Reichstag was to have been a signal for a bloody uprising and civil war. So how useful is this source as evidence for the cause of the Reichstag fire? Okay, so it's quite useful in the sense that it tells us what the official government line was about the Reichstag fire. It tells us that officially the government saw the Reichstag fire as an act, a communist act, act of terrorism in an attempt to overthrow the government, as the start of a civil war, it's suggesting. We can support that because, as we know, Marinus van der Lubbe is caught in the Reichstag building setting fires, and as a communist, that would link to the communist plot theory. And as we know afterwards, the Nazis start banning they ban the Communist Party. They arrest loads of communist leaders, which makes it easier for their election later on, which is the other argument as well. So we could also argue actually this source isn't that useful because it suggests that it's a communist plot, but there is evidence to suggest otherwise. And some historians argue that actually, because the Reichstag fire was so convenient to the Nazis, because it gave the Nazis the excuse to restrict freedoms, ban political parties later on, also limit the powers of the Communist Party, it's too convenient. And actually, whilst the official party line is a communist plot, it works out so well for the Nazis. There's a suggestion there that actually maybe it wasn't a communist plot, maybe it was the Nazis that did it. And if you listen to the podcast that we did on the rise of Hitler, we mentioned that some historians have found old archives in Moscow, weirdly, from the SA. And in those, it suggests that there might have been an SA commando unit that have been involved in the Reichstag fire. So, yeah, the question is, how useful is this source? It's really useful because it tells us official government policy and the official government line, but it doesn't tell us that actually it's not that straightforward. Right, lastly, it's a cartoon published by a British newspaper on the 4th of March 1933, where it says Vox Populi, which is the name of the source. That means voice of the people. So the question the exam is asking us is, what is the message of this cartoon? So 4th of March 1933, hopefully you'll know that is the election day. So when Hitler becomes Chancellor in January 1933, he immediately says, right, I want an election in March 1933 because I want a majority. And if you remember, the Reichstag fire is really convenient for him because the Reichstag fire kicks off on the 27th of February, right before this election. So all of a sudden, Hitler can ask Hindenburg for more powers after the Reichstag fire, which can help him chase after the communists who had a decent share of seats in the Reichstag before this, about 17%. So, going back to this source, what is the message of this source? Well, look at it. It's a polling, it says over here, polling booth. Who is not with us is against us. There's a voter. We got SA members over here, or at least Nazis over here, they're probably SA, shouting Heil Hitler. He's walking up to a ballot box. Hitler's there holding the string to what presumably is a guillotine. And we've got chaps over here looking through the ballot box. So, what is the message of this source? Well, does this look like it's going to be a fair election? Hopefully, you'll be looking at this going, well, actually, no. Why is it not going to be fair? Well, the voters are going to be intimidated by this. there is clear intimidation in this election. Now, obviously, the artist has drawn that. It's a metaphor. It's drawn that to suggest, that people are going to be scared going to the vote box, the ballot box. But in reality, they would have been scared. The SA members surrounded polling stations on election day. The fear that the Nazis might find out who you voted for would have been a real one to a lot of people. And obviously, the whole process would have been a scary one. This is in the background of the Reichstag fire, so Hitler has extra power at this point. So the message of the cartoon is that because of the intimidation, voters don't really have the freedom that they would hope going to the ballot box. They would have felt scared about going to the ballot box due to the intimidation that the Nazis are showing. Okay, right. I think that's the last one. That one, yep. Right. What about life in Nazi Germany itself? So very quickly, we've got 3 sources here. I think this one's probably one of the easier ones. So question 4A here is, why was this painting published in Germany in the 1930s? Hopefully this is a really obvious question. It's celebrating something. What do you think it's celebrating? Well, 2 things, I suppose. Aryans, but more importantly, the idea of the Aryan family. How do we know this is the perfect family? Well, hopefully the amount of children you see is a suggestion. 4 children in this family. An Aryan mother, obviously all of them are Aryans, but mother and father are there as a loving family unit. So why was this painting created? It was created to try and encourage Aryans to have lots of children. This was the Nazi vision of a perfect family for their Germany. It's purebred German race. And they created a lot of propaganda to try and encourage people, Aryans, to have children. And you could talk about the methods they used, the loans, the marriage loans they created, the medals that were awarded to women to have lots of children, and the fact that abortions were illegalized. These are all methods the Nazis used to try and encourage this family unit. So yeah, the message of the source, sorry, not the message, the purpose of this is to try and encourage Aryans to have lots of children and have this kind of family. You notice that they're also farmer types. They're working off the land. Again, the Nazis really liked farming, the farmers in Germany. The blood and soil idea that they're the real true Germans, and it's kind of linking that into the family unit here. Right, this question, yes. The Hitler Jugend. A poster published in Germany in the 1930s, the slogan means, "Come to us in the Hitler Youth." So the question is, how far does this poster show why the Hitler Youth was popular with young people? Well, hopefully, you'll look at this and go, well, this doesn't really tell us why the Hitler Youth were popular. It's just a picture of a guy holding a flag, which, yes, is true to an extent, but it is slightly popular. What do we notice about the guy holding the flag? What's he wearing? Because it's going to tell us something, isn't it? It's going to tell us something about its popularity. He's wearing a Hitler Youth uniform, which is very militaristic. So what this poster tells us is that children would have enjoyed going to the Hitler Youth because they got to wear military-style uniform. And as we know, we can add to that with our own knowledge that they were able to take part in marches and learn key skills such as firing a gun, how to read maps, these kind of military-style skills. So the question is, how far does this poster show why the Hitler Youth was popular to young people? It shows us that, or it gives us an insight that actually the military is really important, and young people tend to like the military. But it doesn't tell us about the other opportunities, like the camping that was involved in the Hitler Youth. And actually, a lot of poorer children wouldn't have that opportunity to go out on holidays, and the Hitler Youth kind of gave them that possibility. So it is useful to an extent, but it only scrapes the surface of the reasons why the Hitler Youth was popular. Right, and what's our last source here? Right, this is a source by Fritz Tyson. He was one of the guys who was giving Hitler the money in our previous source. We go back to this one here. Yeah, he was one of the businessmen giving Hitler money in the 1930s before Hitler came to power. So the question for this source is, are you surprised by this source? So Fritz Tyson, writing about the late 1930s in his book I Paid Hitler, which was published in 1941. Tyson was a German industrialist, who financially supported Hitler. So, what does Tyson have to say for himself? In the 1930s, Hitler thought of a new idea. It was that every German shall own his own car. Hitler asked industry to design a popular car model to be built at such a low price that millions could buy it. The Volkswagen People's Car has been talked of for the past 5 years, but has never been for sale. The People's Car is one of the most bizarre ideas the Nazis ever had. German wages are low and petrol expensive. German workers never dreamed of buying a car. To them, it was a luxury. So, the question, remember, is, are you surprised by this source? What do we think? Are we surprised? Well, hopefully you'll realise that the facts there are true, that the Nazis did create a scheme where workers were encouraged to save up tokens to eventually pay for a new car through the Strength Through Joy scheme. So that doesn't surprise us. What does surprise us is that this source is written in 1941 by a German, and he's criticising the Nazis. That's quite a strange thing to do, and particularly during wartime when the Nazis will want to have absolute control over the people because it needs full support from the people to help fight this war effort. So, factually not surprising, but the fact that this guy, Fritz Tyson, is writing a book and it's been published in 1941 criticising Nazis, that might be a surprise. And that's something worth bearing in mind. Okay, all right, last one. This one's all about persecution, this topic. So we've got the Jewish source here, the Nuremberg rally, and this source here about freedoms being crushed. So, very quickly, excuse me. So, the question for this one here is, why did the Nazis publish this illustration? Now, at the bottom we got an illustration published in a Nazi children's book in the 1930s. So, why did the Nazis publish this illustration? Right, hopefully we recognise that this is a Jewish man. This is a typical Nazi-esque picture of Jewish people. You'll notice that the nose is enlarged and he has quite an evil look about himself. That's how the Nazis drew the Jews. So he is holding an Aryan woman and he's trying to lure her away with, looks like a pearly necklace or something, a diamond necklace maybe. So why did the Nazis publish this illustration? Why do you think they've done this in a children's book? What are they showing us about the Jews? Are they showing us that they're actually, they're kind people? Well, clearly not, because it's the Nazis. What we're seeing in this picture is there's a Jewish man trying to lure away an Aryan woman, using this jewelry to try and lure her away. Therefore, they're untrustworthy. So that's why this source has been produced in the children's book, is to warn children that Jews are untrustworthy, they shouldn't be trusted. That's using the source. Using our own knowledge, hopefully you'll remember that we talked about the fact that education changes under the Nazis, and we get new topics like race studies in science, where they look at different races and they talk about the Jews and how the Aryans are much greater than the Jews, and how the Jews were responsible in history for all the bad things that have happened to Germany in the past. For example, the end of World War One, the fact they lost in World War One, and the fact the Treaty of Versailles was so harsh. So the source is there being produced to try and encourage children from a very young age, do not trust the Jews. And that's the reason why. Okay, right, let's move on. Source C. A German citizen recalls a Nuremberg rally. At the time for the Führer's arrival, let me start that again. As the time for the Führer's arrival drew near, the crowd grew restless. Suddenly, the beat of the drums increased, and a fleet of black cars rolled into the arena. The stadium looked like a sea of swastikas. Hitler began to speak. The crowd hushed into silence, but the drums continued their steady beat. Hitler's voice cut through the darkness. The crowd began to chant Sieg Heil over and over again. So the question is, how useful is this source as evidence of Nazi propaganda? Now that's an interesting one, because if you look at this, you think, well, hang on, it's not necessarily from a leaflet. We don't know it's from a poster or anything like that. This is just a German citizen talking about it. But of course, Nuremberg rallies were a form of propaganda. They were a form of showing just how well organised and powerful this Nazi Germany is. If you remember the Nuremberg rallies, there were these big marching displays where lots of soldiers, Hitler Youth members would march around, well organised, and then we have this climax where Hitler does this big speech at the end. So it's an exciting day for the Germans, but it's designed to try and show the German people, look how well organised we are. Not like the Weimar government days, where it was just chaotic. Look how well organised we are. So actually, as a piece of propaganda, it's very, very good. But the question is asking us, how useful is it? Yeah, it's useful because it tells us about the power of Hitler in the Nuremberg rallies and how this would have influenced the people who were there. What it doesn't tell us is about the other things that Goebbels organised in terms of trying to produce this idea of the Nazi Germany being great. So we could talk about lots of things now. You could talk about the Olympics in 1936. You could talk about the fact that the Nazis used censorship and controlled the media. You could talk about the fact that radios were subsidised. And that links in quite nicely with this because radios were subsidised, which means that the government pays for a part of the radio and the consumers pay for the rest of the radio. And that means that people at home can listen to the Nuremberg rally without actually having to go there. So it's Hitler's message getting into more and more homes. And if you don't own a radio, it doesn't matter. Public speakers are out in market squares giving Hitler speeches. So propaganda was a huge, it covered a huge range of methods that Goebbels used. This is just one small part of it. So how useful is this source as evidence of Nazi propaganda? Really useful, but it doesn't tell us about the other things that the Nazis used. Okay, and lastly, we got, I'll zoom out a little bit here, a cartoon from an American magazine published in 1936. So it's an American cartoon. So already we know the Americans are going to be critical of the Nazis. So this is going to be a negative portrayal of Nazi Germany. So we might have to zoom in a little bit here. It says at the bottom, you see at the top is Hitler and his cronies. There's Goebbels and there's Goering as well. Hitler's making a speech, and in his speech he says the word, "In these 3 years I have restored honour and freedom to the German people." And yet under his podium we have religious freedoms suppressed, academic freedom suppressed, labour unions, fraternal organisations, opposition parties suppressed, women's independence suppressed, freedom of the press suppressed, judicial integrity suppressed. So the question here is, what is the message of this cartoon? What is the message of this cartoon? Well, crucially, we need to look at this speech bit. In these 3 years, I've restored honour and freedom to the German people. Has he restored honour and freedom to the German people? Well, if all these freedoms are being suppressed, then no, he hasn't. So the message here is that what Hitler's telling the people of Germany isn't true. We know it's not true because he is suppressing, for example, let's have a look at one of these. He's suppressing opposition parties, so there's no other opposition parties allowed. How can he claim to have restored honour and freedom to Germany? Or how does he claim to restore freedom to Germany if you don't have the freedom to vote for a different political party? He's got judicial integrity here. How can he possibly claim that there's honour and freedom in Germany if the judiciary, if the courts aren't fair? How do we know the courts aren't fair? Well, because top Nazi officials were appointed onto the courts. So it was Nazis who got the final say on whether someone was guilty or not. So Hitler is hoodwinking, if you like, the German population. They shouldn't believe him when he says, "I'm bringing these freedoms to you," because actually he's suppressing a lot of freedoms. So to answer this question, well, we need to make that point. That's the message. And then we need to give our own knowledge to give some examples of that. So, yeah, labour unions, that's trade unions. Well, trade unions were banned in 1933, and then he introduced the Nazi trade union that had far less power than all the trade unions it replaced. So there's an example. Yeah, that's that really. So those are the sources that could come up in the exam, and that's how we go about answering them. Okay, good luck.